Hello once again, and welcome to the final set of slides in questionnaire design and delivery materials. And the focus in this slot is on preparing our data for analysis and why it's a good idea to anticipate the analysis at the planning stage of your questionnaire. And I'd just like to acknowledge again my colleague Izzy Bray from the University of the West of England, who developed the original version of these slides for our face-to-face course.
So this session is thinking about how to code your data, how to turn those responses into codes, numbers that we can then interrogate in our statistical analysis. I'm going to look at how we create a data file and give you some tips on how to set that up. And I'll touch on the idea about how we recognise types of data that are generated by your questionnaire. And I would advise that if these concepts are new to you, if looking at data types and data analysis, if this is the first time you've considered this, then it would be very helpful to look at the quantitative data slides, which are available as a slide set on the ArcWest website. Lastly, I'll just give you some top tips for how to process those open questions you may have included in your questionnaire, those ones without fixed responses where we've generated free text, and just a few tips about how we process those questions.
So what we're talking about here really is making sure we can get the data out. Once we sort of nailed down that how we go about collecting data, we want to make sure we can get our data out and be able to work with the data and draw those interpretations and conclusions from it. So we call this coding really. We want to basically find a system for assigning numbers to the different response options. So we're giving response options often in sort of categories which we've described, labels that we've given things. But when we want to capture that data to enable us to do that analysis, we want to find a system for assigning numbers to those response options so we can work with them numerically. And coding, obviously, beyond that is about devising a coding frame for all of the questions to capture all of the data that comes in, as well as how we work with open questions. So let's start with an example. What does coding of a questionnaire look like? So here are some example questions from a real survey that was distributed. And as you can see, we've got a number of different options for how we might answer the questions. And the first one is a sort of scale from strongly agree down to strongly disagree, and then a category that's sort of when the person doesn't fit into that set of answers at all, there's an additional option there for I don't drink alcohol. So what we're doing here really is just to demonstrate that each of those response options, if you can see there on this slide, it's a bit small, but in the bottom right hand corner of each option box there's a number. And so basically each answer corresponds to a number that we assign it. And this is how we would start our sort of coding sheet. We take a copy of our questionnaire and we actually assign numbers to every possible answer to each question. And we've got the same there at the bottom, a different sort of scale there or different sort of set of answer options, but again, all sort of written descriptions to which we can apply a numerical label. And as I say there, it's captured in the bottom right hand corner of the response box.
So this is what a data file might look like, and we might use something like Excel or another database package to generate a grid, and this is where we record all of the answers from each respondent to each question. And as shown here, normally each row represents each person who's responded and each column one of the variables or the questions that we've asked. And we record the responses as codes, as we were just talking about. And this data file is the basis on which you then carry out your data analysis.
So let's have a look at how we might code this question, which is a bit trickier because we've given the option for the person to tick all those that apply. So in fact, effectively somebody could tick walk, bicycle, rail. Indeed, I would do that when I normally travel to work. So in effect, we're actually asking 8 different questions. And for each one, we can have a binary response, either yes or no. And so we need therefore 8 columns for this question in our data sheet to have the opportunity to provide an answer for each one as either yes or no. So this slide is definitely revisiting some of the material from the quantitative data session. So I'm not going to go into the explanations again, but just to recap really that and remind you that our questions will be generating different types of data. And it's a good idea to recognise those different types of data as part of the coding process and anticipating the kind of analysis and statistics we're going to be able to generate. In the next couple of slides, I'll just refresh some of those definitions shown here on this slide that were covered in the quantitative session. Okay, so let's have just a quick refresh of categorical variables. These divide into these three categories, these three types: binary, nominal, ordinal. The binary, I think by now you're probably familiar, is the ones where things fall into two clear categories only. So questions with a yes, no answer, smoker, non-smoker. And we usually code these either 0, 1 or 1, 2. And we can generate those sorts of descriptive statistics shown now on the right hand side, again, all covered in that quantitative session if you feel you want a reminder of those. The nominal data is those which fall into more than two of unordered categories. So these are the more sort of described, sort of named categories, which we might put on things like social class, ethnicity. These are descriptions, but we can again code them with a number, but these are used as labels for the rather than a value, if you like. And then thirdly, there's ordinal data, and these are similarly descriptive categories, but that fall into some kind of order, a scale, perhaps an increasing scale or whatever. And again, we put a numeric code to correspond to the ordering of the categories. And examples here would be things like the scales we so commonly see, for agreement, say, running from strongly disagree to strongly agree, via various sort of demarcations, level of satisfaction, pain, all the sort of common things we might be collecting in our evaluations. And again, the same range of statistics can be used to represent those and illustrate those. And here we've got the same thing for numerical variables, some examples of both discrete and continuous. So discrete, the ones we can count in whole numbers; continuous, those which we can measure in less than whole numbers. So discrete, some examples: whole numbers of children in a family, number of GP visits, things that we can count, we can add up and generate frequencies, we can illustrate with a bar chart. And for continuous, we've got those sorts of examples, a person's income, weight, height, things which we can break down into quite precise measurements using a using a scale. And this opens up some more opportunities for both representing our data and analysing, interrogating it. So this is an exercise. You can pause the slides and have a look at this before we go through the answers, just to give you a little bit more practice at recognising data types in your questionnaire and how we might code those. Okay, so assuming you've had a bit of a time to think about that, you've paused the slides and perhaps made some notes, let's just run through the first question on sun habits. And this, I hope you've identified as an ordinal variable, because we've got a scale going from never to always. So we can put responses in some sort of order, and we can assign a different number, perhaps from starting with 0 up to 4 for each of those different responses. The second question is, I hope again that you agree, is nominal, because there's no particular order to categories. This is just, a name description that we've put on each item. And again, you can just assign each category as a number from 1 to 6 to identify each of the different options chosen. And then the final question is another ordinal variable, as the categories go up in an order from low to high. So again, we can assign a number to code each of the different answers. So what about the open questions? Rather less neat and tidy than those quantitative questions, but nonetheless we need to find some system for sort of condensing the data that we have gathered from those questions. So we start really by being guided by the questions you've asked, and I suggest setting up a simple framework, really just a table of those themes, if you like. Each question perhaps tends to relate to some aspect, some theme in your data that you're interested in. But also we look at the data itself and become quite familiar with those answers. That does involve reading through the answers to the open questions. I know it might sound obvious, but I think sometimes people go straight to trying to summarise things before they're actually really familiar with what's being provided in those sorts of questions. And then we can just see, are there some commonalities that start to emerge when you read through them, where people are always giving the same sort of comment? and perhaps then you might add that as a theme in your table. And then we go about really applying that framework or that table, that structure, to the data from the open questions. So we read the answers and summarise the common message under each sort of theme. And I'm going to illustrate all of this on the next slide. And then you may want to have a think about some of the non-typical responses, because that's sometimes the reason why people have used the open questions. Some people skip over them because they take more effort to actually write what we're feeling, than compared to the ticking boxes and things that's happened in the rest of the questionnaire. So that sometimes the answers in the open questions are the person who's got something that's a bit non-typical to tell us about. And that's important for you really to make a judgment about whether that's important to the data as a whole. But sometimes if we feel that perhaps it's not essential, the thing that's been shared is an experience, but not something which we feel is necessarily representative or typical of people's experience, we don't need to include that. But it's sometimes quite telling. So my top tips are just not to get overwhelmed at this point. This isn't a qualitative approach to data collection. We haven't we haven't been sort of looking into the answers in a lot of depth using a questionnaire method. So the open questions, have a place in a questionnaire, but they're not the sort of bulk of our data. So try not to get overwhelmed and think that you can represent everyone's views. That's not the purpose. Okay, so we just need to, and I encourage you really just to be realistic and give a summary of those themes. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you what I mean by how we do that. So last couple of slides on this, but this slide is just to illustrate what I meant by framework, which is just a table, as I said, where we capture the question that was asked in the first column. And the middle column is about any sort of additional themes that emerged in the answers from that question, so we can break it down a little bit further if you like. And then we just try and record some of the more typical responses. And as I said, if you want to add a column for more non-typical things so they don't get lost, that's fine. And as I say, that's your sort of judgment about what you feel is important in your data. So this table just illustrates a question that was in a survey relating to a new outpatient service. And so the question was asked, is there anything specific prevents you using the service? And I could see straight away in the data that there were some themes emerging very commonly. People were highlighting particular barriers to using the service. There was a lot of comments about transport and costs and parking and things like that. And then appointment availability. So I just break down that question into sort of 3 themes, which were the bulk of answers. And then I just captured what I felt were some of the most useful, or not useful really, but really reflected the kind of comments people were giving under each of those themes. And then we had an open question about any other comments, which, as I said earlier, is a good sort of thing to just be polite and give people that space to tell us how they're really feeling. It's quite widely used, that sort of area, and so it was by looking at them it was clear that the comments divided into positive and negative, and we were able to just summarize some of the meaning of those or the typical comments from those questions. So just the last word as we reach the end of this slide set on designing and delivering questionnaires. And that's just to acknowledge that all of the things we've been talking about throughout these sessions do constitute quite a hefty task, and designing your own survey is quite a big undertaking, not something you can just rattle off in an afternoon. So before you head into this, and this is not to put anybody off, but it's just important to make people aware that you may want to look to see what other tools already exist that might be going to measure what you're hoping to measure, and therefore save you a lot of time. And another advantage of doing that is that many of the well-established tools that exist for measuring health and well-being are, of course, already validated. So that means we already know that they're measuring what they claim to measure, that they're valid, and they do this in a consistent way. So that concept about reliability. So just to point out a really useful link to commonly used validated outcome measures. And the link here in the next bullet point on the slide is to the evaluation online toolkit at that URL. And the link highlighted there will take you straight to the area where you can find this sort of list, if you like, of validated outcome measures. And just to say, following on from that, if you do choose to use one of those tools, then it's important just to check in which populations those tools have been validated. And that information is given in the listing in the toolkit. Because of course, if it hasn't been tested in the same type of population as the one you're proposing to use it in, then it isn't necessarily valid. So that's just a word of caution. And then there's a further link in the final bullet point there of an interesting review of, again, 99 commonly used outcome measures for assessing well-being in adults. And just a final summary of the topics we've been covering in this final slide set. We've talked about the importance of being able to recognise the different types of data you're collecting in your questionnaire. We've talked about how to create a data file, just a spreadsheet, to capture those responses from each respondent to each question, and that'll be the basis on which we can carry out some analysis. You've had the slide set about quantitative data and some basic descriptive statistics and how to present your data, but you may also wish to seek advice from a statistician about which statistical tests are appropriate and how to run those. And we talked just very briefly at the end about using a simple framework to capture data from the open questions in your questionnaire. Once again, just to remind you the importance of just reflecting on the fact that we know the time and resources you have available will affect the quality of your questionnaire, just as it will the overall evaluation, and therefore ultimately the quality of your data. And I wish you all the best with designing your questionnaire and carrying out your survey. Thank you.